On September 11, 2001, the world witnessed a tragedy that would forever alter the course of history. That morning, 4 commercial airplanes were hijacked by terrorists associated with the Islamic extremist group Al-Qaeda. The hijackers took control of 2 of these planes and crashed them into the Twin Towers of the World Trade Center in New York City, while another plane was flown into the Pentagon in Arlington, Virginia. The 4th plane, United Airlines Flight 93, crashed into a field in Pennsylvania after passengers attempted to overcome the hijackers. The coordinated nature of the attacks and their sheer scale left the world in shock. It wasn't just the horror of the day that left a lasting impact, but also the way these events shaped geopolitics, security policies, and public perception. The devastation of the World Trade Center towers was almost beyond belief. Both towers collapsed within hours of being struck, sending plumes of smoke and debris into the streets below, engulfing everything in a haze of destruction. The chaos that followed was unprecedented. Emergency responders and ordinary citizens alike scrambled to find survivors, with little hope for success. The collapse of these symbols of American economic power signified not just the loss of life, but the beginning of a new chapter in global security concerns. The Pentagon, too, suffered massive damage, symbolizing that no place, no matter how important, was safe from the reach of terrorism. In the immediate aftermath, the United States responded swiftly. President George W. Bush declared a war on terror, which involved military action in Afghanistan to dismantle al-Qaeda and oust the Taliban regime that had been harboring the group. The attacks also led to significant changes in domestic security, with the creation of the Department of Homeland Security and the passage of the USA Patriot Act, which granted the government expanded surveillance and law enforcement powers. These measures, while aimed at preventing further attacks, would come to represent a shift towards increased government control over citizens' privacy and civil liberties. Yet, as time passed, the attacks became a subject of intense scrutiny, with many people questioning the official narrative. In the years following September 11, alternative theories about the attacks began to emerge, offering different explanations for what had actually occurred. These theories suggested that there was more to the story than the government had let on and pointed to inconsistencies in the official account of the events. Questions arose about how the attacks were allowed to happen, why certain intelligence failures occurred, and whether some parties might have had foreknowledge of the plot. As the years went by, these theories evolved, gaining traction among a growing number of people who felt that the government was either hiding the truth or, in some cases, complicit in the events. The initial shock and grief that followed the tragedy began to give way to suspicion, as people looked for answers that seemed to be missing. The unanswered questions surrounding the attacks have fueled a persistent sense of doubt and curiosity, with some people seeking alternative explanations that challenge the mainstream narrative. In conclusion, the events of September 11, 2001, will always be remembered as one of the most significant and devastating moments in modern history. The world changed that day, and it changed for good. The consequences of the attacks can still be seen in the wars that followed, the security measures that were put in place, and the ongoing debates about the truth behind the events. But for many, the unanswered questions continue to haunt them, leaving them searching for answers and asking, was everything really as it seemed? The official explanation for the 9/11 attacks has remained largely unchanged since that fateful day. According to the U.S. government, the terrorist group Al-Qaeda, led by Osama bin Laden, was responsible for orchestrating the attacks. The plot involved 19 hijackers who took control of 4 commercial airplanes, using them as weapons to strike high-profile American landmarks. 2 planes were flown into the World Trade Center towers, 1 into the Pentagon, and the last crashed into a field in Pennsylvania after passengers attempted to overcome the hijackers. The government's story, detailed in the 9/11 Commission report, claims that the attacks were the result of a well-planned and executed operation by Al-Qaeda, a group with a long history of targeting the United States and its allies. Osama bin Laden, the figurehead of Al-Qaeda, claimed responsibility for the attacks shortly after they occurred. He cited U.S. foreign policy in the Middle East, particularly its support for Israel and the presence of American troops in Saudi Arabia, as motivations for the assault. The U.S. government and intelligence agencies quickly rallied behind this explanation, with bin Laden's organization being named as the sole perpetrators. The attack was framed as an act of war, and bin Laden became the primary target in the ensuing War on Terror, launched by the United States. The government's account of 9/11 was supported by a combination of intelligence gathered before and after the attacks. In the years leading up to 2001, there had been warnings of potential terrorist activity from al-Qaeda, including the bombing of U.S. embassies in Africa in 1998 and the bombing of the USS Cole in 2000. The intelligence community had also tracked al-Qaeda's activities, but the scale of the 9/11 attacks was not anticipated. The hijackers used their knowledge of U.S. security weaknesses, exploiting vulnerabilities in airport security and flight training to carry out their mission with devastating precision. However, despite the seemingly clear-cut nature of the government's explanation, many people were left with questions. Some doubted the official account, questioning how such a sophisticated and coordinated attack could have been carried out without assistance from within the United States or other external sources. The fact that the U.S. intelligence community had failed to prevent the attacks despite multiple warnings raised suspicions that perhaps there were elements within the government or its agencies that were complicit, or at the very least, negligent. Furthermore, the notion that a small group of terrorists, working with limited resources, could carry out an attack of such magnitude left some people wondering if the real story was being hidden. Could there have been a deeper conspiracy at play? This skepticism was only compounded by the subsequent events that unfolded. The War on Terror led to the invasion of Afghanistan and Iraq, both of which became embroiled in ongoing conflicts, resulting in a massive loss of life and resources. The justification for these wars, based on the premise that al-Qaeda was behind the attacks and posed an ongoing threat, only intensified the public's desire for answers. In the aftermath of 9/11, the government's actions, including the controversial Patriot Act and the establishment of the Department of Homeland Security, further fueled doubts. Critics argued that these measures, while intended to prevent future attacks, were also used to erode civil liberties and expand government surveillance, prompting many to ask if the attacks were being used as an excuse for an overreach of power. As time passed, public skepticism grew, with many questioning whether the official version of events was the complete truth or if something more sinister was at play. This growing discontent laid the foundation for the rise of various conspiracy theories surrounding the attacks. In the aftermath of the 9/11 attacks, many people around the world were left grappling with a sense of disbelief and confusion. The scale of the tragedy, combined with the swiftness and precision of the assault, led to widespread shock. However, as the initial grief began to settle, a growing number of individuals and groups began to question the official narrative provided by the U.S. government. The doubt was not immediate, but rather developed over time as more information and analysis became available. People who had lived through the shock were now reflecting on the events, considering alternative explanations, and wondering if the full truth was being concealed. One of the first and most persistent questions revolved around the role of U.S. intelligence agencies. How could the attacks have occurred when there were numerous warning signs in the years leading up to 9/11? Reports surfaced of al-Qaeda's increasing activity and planning, including the bombing of U.S. embassies in Africa and the attack on the USS Cole. Yet, despite these warning signs, the government seemed unprepared for the scale of the assault. The 9/11 Commission, established to investigate the attacks, found that there were failures of imagination within the intelligence community, and many felt that such a catastrophic event could have been prevented if the U.S. government had acted on these warnings. However, the idea that the attacks were the result of an intelligence failure began to lose traction as questions about the involvement of insiders arose. Some theories suggested that certain individuals within the U.S. government or the intelligence agencies may have had prior knowledge of the attacks, but failed to act upon it. There were even claims that the government had allowed the attacks to happen as a means of advancing its political and military agendas. These accusations were fueled by allegations of covert operations and political maneuvering that had occurred in the years leading up to 9/11. While no concrete evidence emerged to prove such claims, the seeds of doubt were planted, and public trust in the government began to erode. Theories about U.S. involvement were not limited to the intelligence community. Many skeptics began to question the role of the military. On the morning of 9/11, the hijacked planes were flying through U.S. airspace for an extended period before they were intercepted. The inability of the U.S. Air Force to respond in a timely manner raised suspicions about whether military leaders were deliberately standing down, allowing the attacks to unfold. The fact that these planes flew off course and the U.S. government failed to launch an effective response was seen by some as further evidence of complicity or incompetence at the highest levels. Some conspiracy theorists began to propose the idea that 9/11 could have been an inside job, a term that has become synonymous with a variety of theories suggesting that elements within the U.S. government or military orchestrated the attacks for their own gain. The idea that an attack of such magnitude could have been facilitated or even planned by the very institutions responsible for protecting the country was an unsettling thought, but it gained traction as individuals scrutinized the government's actions before and after the attacks. For many, the questioning of the official narrative was not driven by a single event, but rather a series of inconsistencies and unanswered questions. The more people delved into the details, the more they felt that the pieces of the puzzle were not fitting together. For some, the official story was simply too convenient and tidy, while for others, the gaps in the government's explanation made it seem as though vital details were being deliberately hidden. The questions continued to grow. How could the government have been so unaware of the threat? Was there a larger plan in motion? And, most hauntingly, could there have been a cover-up? These doubts sparked a wave of alternative explanations and conspiracy theories, each attempting to uncover a different version of what really happened on September 11, 2001. As the years passed, this growing skepticism continued to evolve. Many felt that the search for answers was being stifled, while others insisted that the truth would eventually come to light. But one thing became clear: 9/11 was not just a tragedy, it was a catalyst for a broader debate about government transparency, accountability, and the extent to which those in power can be trusted. The unanswered questions surrounding the attacks have remained a source of fascination and suspicion for many, shaping how people view not only the events of that day but the role of government in shaping history itself. Among the most widely discussed conspiracy theories surrounding the 9/11 attacks is the claim that the destruction of the World Trade Center towers was not the result of plane crashes and fires alone but was instead caused by a controlled demolition. This theory suggests that explosives were strategically placed inside the towers prior to the attacks, causing them to collapse in a way that resembled the planned demolition of large buildings. The theory has gained a substantial following over the years, fueled by questions about the speed and manner in which the towers fell. One of the key points that proponents of the controlled demolition theory emphasize is the speed at which the Twin Towers collapsed. They argue that the towers fell too quickly for it to be simply the result of the impact from the hijacked planes and the ensuing fires. According to experts in controlled demolitions, a building's structural integrity must be compromised in a highly specific way for it to collapse in the manner that the World Trade Center did. The argument is that such a precise and symmetrical collapse, with the buildings falling straight down into their own footprint, could only be achieved by the use of explosives. Further fueling the theory are testimonies from first responders and witnesses who claimed to hear what sounded like explosions just before the buildings collapsed. These reports have been cited as evidence that explosives were used to bring the towers down, as the timing of the collapses seemed to coincide with these alleged explosions. Many witnesses, including firefighters and emergency workers on the scene, have also reported hearing multiple blasts during the event. This has led to the suggestion that explosive charges were strategically placed throughout the buildings in anticipation of the attack, and that they were detonated in a way that ensured the towers would collapse without toppling over in an uncontrolled manner. In addition to the physical evidence, there is a larger body of research that looks at the way the buildings were constructed. The Twin Towers were known for their innovative design, featuring a central core of steel columns and a network of exterior columns that helped to support the weight of the building. The official explanation for the collapse centers on the impact of the hijacked planes and the subsequent fires, which caused the steel structure to weaken and eventually fail. However, some critics argue that the heat generated by the fires should not have been sufficient to cause the steel to melt or lose its structural integrity to such an extent. The theory of controlled demolition posits that the building's collapse was too perfectly executed to have occurred by accident. One of the most significant challenges faced by proponents of the controlled demolition theory is the lack of definitive physical evidence that explosives were used. Despite the numerous reports of explosions and the theories surrounding the collapse, no one has been able to provide conclusive proof that explosives were placed inside the towers in advance of the attacks. The National Institute of Standards and Technology, NIST, which conducted an extensive investigation into the collapse of the World Trade Center, concluded that the towers fell as a result of the airplane impacts and the subsequent fires, not from explosives. NIST's findings have been cited by the U.S. government and mainstream media as the definitive explanation for the collapse, but many skeptics remain unconvinced. Critics of the controlled demolition theory point out that there are alternative explanations for the phenomena reported by witnesses. For example, the sounds described as explosions could have been the result of the intense fires, the structural components of the buildings failing, or even the impact of debris falling as the buildings began to collapse. Additionally, the theory does not account for the complexity and logistics involved in planting explosives inside a building the size of the World Trade Center without detection. The sheer scale of the operation required would have been incredibly difficult to pull off without someone noticing, yet there is no evidence to suggest that this was the case. Despite the lack of physical evidence, the controlled demolition theory remains popular among those who believe that the official story of 9/11 is incomplete or misleading. It has become one of the most enduring and controversial explanations for the collapse of the World Trade Center towers, with its supporters continuing to question the narrative put forward by the government. Whether the theory holds any weight or not, it has undoubtedly sparked important conversations about the way large-scale tragedies are explained and understood, and it has left many wondering if there is more to the story than meets the eye. The notion that some people in the U.S. government or within the intelligence community had prior knowledge of the 9/11 attacks, but failed to act, is a key element in many of the conspiracy theories surrounding that day. This theory posits that certain individuals or groups within the government had access to intelligence that indicated an attack was imminent but allowed it to happen for various reasons, such as advancing political agendas or military interests. It is an unsettling idea that challenges the notion that the U.S. government was simply a victim of terrorism, suggesting instead that there may have been some level of complicity or, at the very least, negligence in allowing the tragedy to unfold. One of the main factors that fuels this theory is the existence of intelligence reports that warned of potential terrorist activity leading up to 9/11. The U.S. intelligence community had been aware of al-Qaeda's growing capabilities for years, with warnings of possible attacks on U.S. soil coming from various sources. In fact, before 9/11, U.S. officials had received multiple pieces of intelligence suggesting that al-Qaeda was planning something big. For example, the CIA had information about potential hijacking plots, and there were also reports that pointed to the likelihood of a major attack on U.S. soil. Despite this, many have questioned why such warnings weren't acted upon more decisively to prevent the attack. One of the most widely discussed pieces of intelligence before 9/11 is the so-called Phoenix Memo, which was sent by an FBI agent named Kenneth Williams in July 2001. The memo suggested that al-Qaeda operatives were attempting to infiltrate U.S. flight schools, raising concerns that hijacking could be part of the group's plans. Yet, despite this memo and similar intelligence, no significant steps were taken to prevent the hijackers from carrying out their mission. The inability to connect the dots and act on the information that was available prior to 9/11 has been a source of frustration and suspicion for many. How could the intelligence community, with all its resources, have missed such a glaring threat? Another significant factor that fuels the theory of prior knowledge is the apparent failure of U.S. military forces to intercept the hijacked planes in a timely manner. On the morning of 9/11, the hijacked planes were in U.S. airspace for a considerable amount of time before they crashed into their intended targets. The failure of the U.S. military to scramble fighter jets in a timely manner has been a major point of contention. The fact that no planes were sent to intercept the hijacked aircraft before they reached their targets has raised questions about whether military leaders were intentionally standing down, allowing the attacks to proceed. Some theorists argue that there may have been a deliberate decision made by military or government officials to allow the attacks to happen in order to create a pretext for military intervention and expand the scope of U.S. involvement in the Middle East. The subsequent invasions of Afghanistan and Iraq were justified, in part, by the need to fight terrorism and eliminate threats posed by al-Qaeda and other extremist groups. Critics argue that the attacks provided the perfect justification for these wars, which led to the deaths of thousands of soldiers and civilians, as well as the significant financial costs of the wars. If the attacks were allowed to happen to further these political and military objectives, it would be a damning indictment of those in power. The idea of a false flag operation, in which an attack is carried out in order to serve the interests of a government or powerful elite, is a key part of the prior knowledge theory. According to this line of thinking, the U.S. government could have orchestrated or allowed the attacks to unfold in order to justify a larger military and political agenda. This theory suggests that there may have been elements within the government who saw 9/11 as an opportunity to consolidate power, control resources, and reshape U.S. foreign policy. Despite the compelling nature of these theories, there has been little concrete evidence to suggest that the U.S. government was directly involved in orchestrating the attacks. The 9/11 Commission report, which was produced by an independent panel established by Congress, concluded that there was no evidence of complicity or prior knowledge within the U.S. government. However, the fact that these theories persist is a reflection of the distrust many people feel toward government institutions, especially in the wake of such a monumental tragedy. For some, the idea that the government failed to act or was complicit in the attacks provides a more coherent explanation for the events of 9/11 than the official narrative. In the years following 9/11, public skepticism about the official story has only grown, and many people continue to question whether the true extent of prior knowledge has been fully revealed. This theory, which suggests that the government either allowed or facilitated the attacks for its own purposes, remains one of the most persistent and controversial aspects of the 9/11 conspiracy discussion. Whether it's rooted in legitimate concerns about intelligence failures or a more cynical view of government motives, the idea of prior knowledge continues to shape how people think about 9/11 and its aftermath. One of the most significant and perplexing aspects of the 9/11 attacks is the destruction of World Trade Center Building 7, WTC-7. Unlike the Twin Towers, which were struck by hijacked planes, WTC-7 was not directly hit by any aircraft, yet it collapsed in the afternoon of September 11, 2001, hours after the attacks on the other two buildings. The collapse of WTC-7 has become a focal point for many conspiracy theories, particularly the controlled demolition theory, as it raised questions about why and how a steel-framed building, which wasn't directly impacted by a plane, could collapse in such a dramatic and total manner. The official explanation for the collapse of WTC-7, provided by the National Institute of Standards and Technology, NIST, is that the building was severely damaged by fires ignited by debris from the collapse of the nearby North Tower. These fires burned for several hours, eventually causing the building's steel frame to weaken and the structure to collapse. According to NIST, the fire-induced structural failure was a unique event, as fires of such intensity combined with the structural damage were unprecedented in the history of steel-framed buildings. However, many skeptics find this explanation unsatisfactory, particularly because WTC-7 was not hit by a plane and had never before experienced a collapse from fire alone. What makes the collapse of WTC-7 even more mysterious is the fact that it fell in a near freefall fashion for a brief period of time, as if it were being brought down in a controlled demolition. The building's descent was almost vertical, and it collapsed symmetrically into its own footprint, much like a controlled demolition, where explosives are strategically placed to ensure the building falls in a precise manner. This has led many to question whether explosives were secretly planted in the building in the hours before the attack, and whether the collapse was deliberately engineered. Numerous firefighters, emergency responders, and bystanders reported hearing explosions coming from WTC-7 in the moments before it collapsed. These reports, combined with the building's rapid and uniform collapse, have been used by proponents of the controlled demolition theory to argue that the building's destruction was not the result of fire or structural failure alone. Some point to the testimony of firefighters who stated they had been told that the building would collapse, leading to further suspicion that those in charge of the emergency response may have known that the building was set to fall, which raises questions about how that knowledge was acquired. Skeptics argue that the official investigation by NIST did not adequately address these concerns. The report acknowledged the presence of significant fires in WTC-7, but critics claim that it failed to fully explore the possibility of controlled demolition. They argue that the speed and symmetry of the building's collapse are strong indicators that explosives may have been involved, pointing to the fact that such an event has never been witnessed in modern history without the use of demolitions. For many, the idea that a large office building could collapse so completely from fire damage alone seems implausible, and the theories about controlled demolition continue to gain traction. In response to these theories, proponents of the official explanation maintain that the collapse of WTC-7 was a result of a series of unprecedented and unfortunate circumstances. They argue that the fires, coupled with the structural damage caused by debris from the collapse of the North Tower, weakened the building's critical supports to the point of failure. According to these experts, the collapse followed a relatively slow process that took several hours, and the near freefall observation is simply an optical illusion caused by the speed of the collapse at certain points. Nonetheless, the collapse of WTC-7 remains one of the most contentious aspects of the 9/11 narrative. Despite official reports, many remain unconvinced by the explanations provided by NIST and other authorities. The idea that explosives were used to bring down the building has not only persisted but has also become a central pillar of conspiracy theories about 9/11. The doubts surrounding the collapse have only added to the skepticism regarding the official version of events, and for many, WTC-7 is seen as a crucial piece of evidence that something about the attacks just doesn't add up. Whether or not the collapse of WTC-7 was the result of controlled demolition, or simply an extraordinary and unique chain of events, remains a topic of intense debate. What is clear is that the fall of the building has raised enough questions to continue fueling skepticism about the official narrative of the 9/11 attacks. For those who believe that the full truth has not been disclosed, the mystery of WTC-7 remains one of the most compelling reasons to continue questioning the events of that tragic day. The attack on the Pentagon, which was the target of one of the hijacked planes on September 11, 2001, has also become a focal point for conspiracy theories. While the Pentagon is the symbol of American military power, its vulnerability on that day has sparked significant debate. The official story is that American Airlines Flight 77, a Boeing 757, crashed into the western side of the Pentagon, killing all 64 people aboard the plane and 125 military and civilian personnel inside the building. However, the details surrounding the Pentagon attack have been questioned by conspiracy theorists who suggest that what happened at the Pentagon might not be as straightforward as it seems. One of the most prominent theories about the Pentagon attack is that the damage was not caused by a commercial airliner, but by a missile or some other kind of projectile. Proponents of this theory point to the relatively limited amount of visible wreckage at the Pentagon site, suggesting that a commercial airliner would have left behind more substantial debris. Some critics argue that the hole in the building caused by the impact of Flight 77 was too small for a Boeing 757, leading to speculation that a missile or some other form of explosive device was responsible for the destruction. The lack of substantial wreckage from the plane, including the wings, fuselage, and engines, is cited by skeptics as evidence that a different type of weapon caused the damage. Another key argument put forward by conspiracy theorists is that the flight path of the plane before it hit the Pentagon seems highly improbable. Flight 77 is believed to have flown at an unusually low altitude, performing sharp maneuvers and even diving toward the Pentagon. Critics question how a hijacker, who may not have had extensive flying experience, could have controlled the plane with such precision. Some suggest that the plane's path and impact point may have been altered by outside interference, further casting doubt on the official explanation. In addition to the questions about the plane itself, there are those who argue that there is a deliberate cover-up of the events surrounding the Pentagon attack. Some believe that security camera footage from the area, which would have captured the moment of impact, has been suppressed or destroyed by the government to hide the true nature of the attack. In the years following 9/11, some videos of the Pentagon were released, but critics argue that the footage shown to the public is too limited to provide a clear picture of what actually happened. The fact that only a few frames from security cameras were made available, and that they did not clearly show the plane or the impact, has led to suspicions that the government is withholding evidence that could challenge the official narrative. There are also discrepancies in the eyewitness accounts of the attack. Many witnesses described seeing an object that appeared to be much smaller than a Boeing 757. Leading some to question whether a commercial airliner was really responsible for the damage. Other witnesses reported seeing a missile-like object, though these accounts vary widely, and no conclusive evidence has emerged to support these claims. The conflicting reports from the day of the attack have only fueled further speculation and made it more difficult for the public to discern what really happened. One of the more far-reaching theories involves the idea of a false flag operation, where the government would have staged or allowed the Pentagon attack to happen in order to justify military actions or consolidate power. This theory suggests that the U.S. government may have orchestrated the attack, or at the very least, allowed it to occur as part of a broader plan to advance its political and military objectives. In this view, the attack on the Pentagon was not only an act of terrorism but also a catalyst for the War on Terror and the invasions of Afghanistan and Iraq, which followed in the years after 9/11. While these theories have been thoroughly debunked by official investigations, including those conducted by the 9/11 Commission and the U.S. military, the questions surrounding the Pentagon attack remain a central topic of discussion for conspiracy theorists. The skepticism surrounding the official narrative reflects the broader distrust of government institutions that has only grown since the events of 9/11. Despite the lack of definitive evidence supporting alternative explanations, many people continue to believe that the true story of what happened at the Pentagon has yet to be fully revealed. The attack on the Pentagon remains one of the most controversial and mysterious aspects of 9/11. The lack of clear answers about the specific details of the attack and the continued discrepancies in eyewitness accounts and available evidence have fueled an ongoing debate about the legitimacy of the official version of events. While the vast majority of people accept the government's explanation, a vocal minority continues to question whether the truth behind the Pentagon attack has been obscured, leaving the public with more questions than answers. The events of September 11, 2001, not only shocked the world but also raised a series of unsettling questions about the role of the U.S. military, particularly when it came to the apparent failure of the air defense systems to respond quickly enough to the hijacked planes. On that fateful morning, the 4 planes were flying in U.S. airspace for a significant amount of time before they crashed into their intended targets. Despite the fact that hijackings are not an everyday occurrence, the U.S. military did not intercept the planes in time to prevent the tragedies. For many, this failure to act has raised suspicions about whether the military's response was intentionally delayed, allowing the attacks to unfold, or whether there were deeper issues at play. In the immediate aftermath of the attacks, one of the most pressing questions was why fighter jets weren't scrambled to intercept the hijacked planes before they reached their targets. The U.S. military's standard protocol for dealing with hijacked planes is to intercept them as quickly as possible and, if necessary, to shoot them down to prevent any catastrophic consequences. Yet, in the case of 9/11, the hijacked planes had been in the air for an extended period before they crashed into the Twin Towers and the Pentagon. The first plane, American Airlines Flight 11, was hijacked at 8:14 a.m., and the second, United Airlines Flight 175, was hijacked at 8:42 a.m. By the time Flight 93 crashed in Pennsylvania, the military had still not intercepted any of the planes. One of the key issues surrounding this failure to act quickly is the response time of the North American Aerospace Defense Command, NORAD. NORAD is responsible for monitoring U.S. airspace for potential threats, including hijackings, and ensuring a rapid military response when necessary. However, on 9/11, the military's response was unusually slow. In fact, NORAD was reportedly not aware of the first plane's hijacking until it had already crashed into the North Tower of the World Trade Center at 8:46 a.m. Even after the second plane crashed into the South Tower at 9:03 a.m., fighter jets were not sent into the air immediately to intercept the remaining hijacked planes. It was only after the Pentagon was struck at 9:37 a.m. that the military began scrambling jets to intercept the last 2 planes, but by then, it was too late. For many, the delayed response raises serious questions about why the military wasn't more proactive in responding to the hijackings. Some theorists suggest that the air defense systems may have been intentionally held back, either because the government wanted to allow the attacks to happen for political or military reasons, or because some inside knowledge of the attack was used to let it unfold. The idea that the government either allowed the attacks to happen or that military leaders intentionally delayed their response has been a central element of the inside job theories surrounding 9/11. According to this view, the military's inaction on the morning of 9/11 was not a simple case of incompetence but rather part of a broader conspiracy to enable the attacks for ulterior motives. There is also the issue of whether the military had been adequately prepared for a scenario like the one that played out on 9/11. The hijackers managed to infiltrate U.S. airspace and commandeer the planes without being intercepted, in part because the military had not been anticipating a scenario where multiple planes would be hijacked and used as weapons. At the time, there were no clear protocols for how to respond to a hijacking of this magnitude. The lack of preparedness has been cited by some as a failure of military intelligence, but others suggest that the military could have responded faster if there had been a sense of urgency or prioritization. Skeptics of the official narrative have pointed to these issues as evidence that something more sinister was at play. The idea that the military allowed the attacks to proceed because of political or military interests has persisted, despite the lack of concrete evidence. Some believe that the attacks were part of a larger plan to justify military intervention in the Middle East, particularly in Afghanistan and Iraq. In this view, the inability to stop the hijacked planes in time was not due to incompetence, but part of a strategy to create a pretext for war and to expand U.S. control over key regions. This theory suggests that the government may have intentionally stood down its air defenses in order to allow the attacks to happen, so they could use the ensuing chaos as a justification for military action. In contrast, supporters of the official story argue that the military's response was simply a result of poor communication, confusion, and a lack of preparation for such a coordinated attack. They point out that the 9/11 attacks were unprecedented in terms of scale and complexity, and that the military's response was hindered by the unique nature of the situation. According to this view, the failure to intercept the hijacked planes in time was not a result of any deliberate action, but a combination of miscommunication, lack of readiness, and a failure to recognize the scope of the threat until it was too late. Regardless of the perspective one holds, the failure of the U.S. military to respond quickly enough to the hijacked planes on 9/11 remains one of the most troubling aspects of the entire event. Whether it was due to incompetence, miscommunication, or intentional delay, the question of why the military did not act more swiftly to prevent the attacks continues to fuel skepticism and conspiracy theories about the true nature of what occurred that day. The events of September 11, 2001, unleashed a wave of political and military actions that would reshape U.S. foreign policy for years to come. In the aftermath of the attacks, the U.S. government launched the War on Terror, which included military interventions in Afghanistan and Iraq. For many, the rationale behind these wars was clear. The United States had been attacked by terrorist groups, and it was now necessary to act in order to eliminate those responsible and prevent future threats. However, a growing number of skeptics have questioned whether the attacks themselves were used as a pretext for these wars, suggesting that the government may have had a broader agenda in the Middle East that was only made possible by the tragedy of 9/11. One of the most widely discussed aspects of this theory is the idea that the U.S. government had long been planning military intervention in the Middle East, particularly in Afghanistan and Iraq, and that the 9/11 attacks provided the perfect justification for these actions. Prior to 9/11, the U.S. had already expressed interest in securing greater influence in the region, particularly in relation to oil and strategic military positioning. The attacks on 9/11, with their devastating impact and the subsequent fears of terrorism, created an environment in which military action could be justified on the grounds of national security. In the case of Afghanistan, the U.S. response was directly tied to the presence of al-Qaeda and the Taliban regime that was harboring the terrorist group. The U.S. government made it clear that they would not rest until al-Qaeda was dismantled and Osama bin Laden was captured. While many believe this to be a legitimate response to the attacks, others argue that the invasion of Afghanistan was not only about going after al-Qaeda, but also about asserting control over a region that was strategically important for both military and economic purposes. Afghanistan, situated at the crossroads of Central Asia, has long been viewed as an area of strategic importance due to its proximity to energy resources and its position as a key transit route for oil and gas pipelines. Similarly, the invasion of Iraq in 2003 raised significant questions. The Bush administration argued that Iraq, under the leadership of Saddam Hussein, was developing weapons of mass destruction, WMDs, and posed a direct threat to the United States. This claim was central to the justification for the invasion. However, no WMDs were found in Iraq, and many have questioned whether the Bush administration exaggerated the threat in order to advance a broader geopolitical agenda. Some have suggested that the invasion of Iraq was part of a larger strategy to secure U.S. influence in the region, particularly in relation to Iraq's oil reserves, which are among the largest in the world. The theory that the 9/11 attacks were used as a pretext for war is often referred to as the false flag theory, in which an event is orchestrated or allowed to happen in order to create a pretext for military action or to advance a political agenda. Proponents of this theory argue that the government either had prior knowledge of the attacks or deliberately allowed them to happen in order to galvanize public support for military interventions in the Middle East. While there is no definitive evidence to support the claim that the attacks were orchestrated or facilitated by the government, many believe that the events of 9/11 provided the perfect opportunity to advance long-held geopolitical objectives. One of the key pieces of evidence cited by critics of the official narrative is the way in which the wars in Afghanistan and Iraq unfolded. The U.S. government's swift military action in both countries raised suspicions that the Bush administration had been preparing for these wars long before 9/11. The timing of the invasions, just a few short years after the attacks, led some to question whether the wars were pre-planned and whether the attacks on 9/11 were used as a convenient catalyst to bring about a broader military strategy. Another aspect of this theory is the idea that the war on terror was also used to justify increased surveillance and the erosion of civil liberties within the United States. The passage of the Patriot Act and the establishment of the Department of Homeland Security were presented as necessary steps to protect the U.S. from future attacks, but many have argued that these measures were also designed to increase government control and surveillance over the American population. The post-9/11 era saw a significant expansion of the U.S. security state, with widespread surveillance programs such as the NSA's mass data collection efforts becoming a key point of controversy. Despite the many questions surrounding the war on terror, the official narrative maintains that the actions taken by the U.S. government were necessary for national security and the protection of the American people. The invasions of Afghanistan and Iraq, as well as the ongoing efforts to combat terrorism, are framed as responses to a direct and existential threat posed by groups like Al-Qaeda. However, for many, the ongoing wars, the loss of life, and the financial costs of the military operations have led them to wonder whether these actions were really about protecting the U.S. or whether they served a deeper, more strategic agenda. In conclusion, the theory that the 9/11 attacks were used as a pretext for war remains one of the most controversial aspects of the 9/11 conspiracy debate. While some view the invasions of Afghanistan and Iraq as necessary responses to the threat posed by terrorism, others believe that the attacks were used as a convenient excuse to advance a broader geopolitical and economic agenda in the Middle East. The true motivations behind these wars, and the role of the 9/11 attacks in justifying them, continue to be a subject of intense debate, with no clear answers in sight. For many, the aftermath of 9/11 has raised more questions than it has answered, leading to ongoing skepticism about the official narrative and the reasons behind the wars that followed. The theory that the 9/11 attacks were in some way linked to Israel's involvement, specifically through its intelligence agency, the Mossad, has been one of the more controversial and widely discussed conspiracy theories. According to proponents of this theory, there are suspicions that elements within the Israeli government, or its intelligence services, may have had foreknowledge of the attacks or, in some versions of the theory, may have even played an active role in orchestrating them. This idea is fueled by the perception that Israel has had significant interests in the outcome of U.S. foreign policy in the Middle East, particularly regarding the situation with Iraq, Afghanistan, and the broader war on terrorism. One of the key arguments made by those who support the Mossad theory is that there were a number of Israeli nationals who were reportedly seen celebrating in New Jersey while watching the Twin Towers collapse. These individuals, according to conspiracy theorists, were allegedly caught filming the attacks and celebrating in a manner that seemed inappropriate given the gravity of the situation. The images and video footage of these men, who were later questioned by authorities, fueled suspicions that they may have had prior knowledge of the attacks. In the aftermath of the event, the FBI reportedly detained several individuals with Israeli ties, although no conclusive evidence was found linking them directly to the attacks. Despite this, the image of these individuals has become a key piece of evidence in the minds of those who believe that Israel had some level of involvement. Moreover, some conspiracy theorists point to the idea that the U.S. and Israel have long had close military and intelligence ties, with Israel's Mossad being one of the most sophisticated and capable intelligence agencies in the world. According to this theory, the Mossad could have been aware of the al-Qaeda plot and possibly even monitored the hijackers as they planned their attack. Supporters of this view argue that the Mossad, given its extensive resources, may have had foreknowledge of the attack and chose to let it unfold in order to advance Israel's strategic interests in the region. The idea is that the attacks would ultimately help shift U.S. policy in the Middle East in favor of Israel, particularly by justifying the war on terror and the U.S. military presence in the region, which in turn would help protect Israeli interests. Another element often cited by those who believe in Mossad's involvement is the notion that the attack on 9/11 provided the perfect opportunity for Israel to benefit from a reshaping of U.S. foreign policy. The resulting wars in Afghanistan and Iraq, both of which had significant geopolitical implications for Israel, were seen by some as favorable to Israeli security. Critics of U.S. foreign policy during the War on Terror have pointed out that the wars in the Middle East destabilized the region, with Israel emerging as a key player in the aftermath of the conflicts. The theory holds that Israel, or at least certain factions within its government, could have seen the 9/11 attacks as a means to advance its own goals by encouraging U.S. military involvement in the region. Critics of the Mossad theory, however, point out that there is no concrete evidence to support the claim that Israel had any involvement in the 9/11 attacks. Most of the claims surrounding Israeli foreknowledge are based on circumstantial evidence, and no intelligence has ever been found to directly connect Israel to the attacks. Furthermore, Israel has been a longtime ally of the United States, and it is highly unlikely that it would jeopardize this relationship by being involved in such a high-profile act of terrorism. The official stance from both U.S. and Israeli authorities has consistently been that Israel was not involved in the attacks in any way, and there is no direct evidence to contradict this. Despite the lack of definitive evidence, the Mossad theory continues to be a popular subject of debate, particularly within certain circles of 9/11 skeptics. The theory taps into broader suspicions about the role of foreign governments and intelligence agencies in influencing U.S. policy, and it reflects a sense of mistrust toward the mainstream explanations for the events of 9/11. Many of those who believe in Mossad's involvement argue that the attacks, and the subsequent U.S. responses, have benefited Israel in ways that go beyond simple coincidence. Whether this is a product of legitimate concern or reaction to the complex nature of geopolitics in the post-9/11 world remains a matter of debate. Ultimately, the theory that Mossad had a role in the 9/11 attacks is an example of how deep-seated suspicions about government actions can lead to the formation of alternative narratives. While the evidence to support these claims remains tenuous at best, the fact that such theories continue to circulate shows the level of distrust and skepticism that exists, particularly when it comes to powerful institutions and international relationships. Whether or not there is any truth to the Mossad conspiracy, it remains a subject that generates intense debate and scrutiny, and it highlights the ongoing uncertainty surrounding the true origins of one of the most catastrophic events in modern history. The 9/11 attacks, as tragic and horrifying as they were, also had far-reaching economic consequences that extended well beyond the immediate aftermath. Many conspiracy theories surrounding the attacks suggest that certain individuals or groups may have profited financially from the chaos and the subsequent wars that followed. The idea that the attacks were, in part, a catalyst for economic gain is a controversial theory that continues to be explored in alternative discussions of the 9/11 events. According to this theory, the attacks may have been used as a pretext for creating profitable opportunities for a select few, particularly in the defense, oil, and security sectors. One of the most frequently cited aspects of this theory is the idea that the War on Terror, which was launched in response to the attacks, led to significant economic benefits for defense contractors and companies involved in the military-industrial complex. The invasion of Afghanistan, followed by the Iraq War, resulted in billions of dollars being spent on military operations, weapons, and logistical support. For many large defense companies, these wars were a boon, providing a massive influx of government contracts and generating enormous profits. In particular, companies like Halliburton, Bechtel, and Lockheed Martin saw substantial increases in business during the early years of the War on Terror. Critics argue that these companies had close ties to the U.S. government, and some even suggest that key political figures were benefiting personally from the contracts and deals that were awarded in the wake of 9/11. Halliburton, for example, a multinational corporation that provides products and services to the energy, construction, and defense industries, is often cited as one of the major beneficiaries of the Iraq War. Dick Cheney, who was vice president at the time of the 9/11 attacks, had previously been the CEO of Halliburton, and this connection raised concerns about conflicts of interest. Critics pointed to the fact that Halliburton received lucrative contracts for military services and rebuilding projects in Iraq, suggesting that the company's ties to Cheney played a role in securing these deals. Some theorists believe that the government's actions in the Middle East were, in part, motivated by the opportunity to enrich companies with strong political connections. Beyond the defense industry, there were other sectors that saw financial gain following the 9/11 attacks. The security industry, for example, experienced a massive expansion as a result of the heightened emphasis on counter-terrorism and national security. The creation of the Department of Homeland Security and the implementation of the USA Patriot Act, which expanded surveillance powers, also contributed to the growth of companies involved in surveillance technologies, private security, and homeland defense. In particular, companies involved in airport security, surveillance equipment, and cybersecurity saw their stock prices rise as the government funneled money into improving national security infrastructure. The private sector's role in these efforts raised concerns about the privatization of national security and the profits being made at the expense of public safety and privacy. Oil and energy companies also stand to benefit from the wars in the Middle East, according to conspiracy theories. The invasion of Iraq, in particular, was seen by some as an opportunity to secure access to one of the largest oil reserves in the world. Critics argue that the U.S. government's interest in Iraq was not solely about removing Saddam Hussein from power or combating terrorism but also about gaining control over Iraq's vast oil resources. The theory suggests that 9/11 provided the perfect pretext for launching a war in Iraq, which would not only eliminate a potential threat but also secure access to the country's oil reserves, benefiting multinational oil companies with significant ties to the U.S. government. The financial impact of the attacks and the subsequent wars was not limited to corporate profits. The attacks themselves caused widespread economic disruption, with the U.S. economy entering a period of uncertainty following the collapse of the Twin Towers and the damage to the Pentagon. The stock market plunged, and many industries, particularly those related to travel and tourism, saw significant losses. However, some sectors experienced a more rapid recovery, particularly those linked to defense and security. In this way, the aftermath of 9/11 created a unique economic environment, where certain industries thrived while others struggled to regain their footing. The theory that the 9/11 attacks were, in part, motivated by economic interests is rooted in the idea that the attacks provided an opportunity to push through policies, contracts, and wars that would benefit powerful corporate interests. While there is no definitive evidence to prove that the attacks were orchestrated with these goals in mind, the financial gains made by certain sectors have raised legitimate questions about the broader motivations behind the events of 9/11. For many, the combination of political, military, and corporate interests in the aftermath of the attacks paints a picture of a world where tragedy can be used as a stepping stone for profit and power. In conclusion, the financial aspect of the 9/11 conspiracy theories highlights the role that economic interests may have played in shaping the post-9/11 world. Whether or not the attacks were used as a pretext for war and corporate gain remains a matter of debate. However, the rapid growth of industries linked to national security, defense, and energy in the wake of the attacks has led many to question whether the economic consequences of 9/11 were part of a broader, more complex strategy. The idea that financial gain played a role in the events of 9/11 adds yet another layer of intrigue and suspicion to an already complex and controversial chapter in history. In the wake of the 9/11 attacks, the United States implemented a range of new laws and policies aimed at preventing future terrorism. Among the most significant of these was the passage of the USA Patriot Act, which drastically expanded the government's surveillance and law enforcement powers. While the law was designed to improve national security, it also raised concerns about the erosion of civil liberties and the potential for abuse of power. Many critics argue that the post-9/11 security measures were not just a reaction to the attacks, but rather an opportunity to further restrict personal freedoms and increase government control over citizens. This theory suggests that the 9/11 attacks provided the perfect pretext for the U.S. government to implement policies that would have otherwise been met with strong opposition. The USA Patriot Act, signed into law by President George W. Bush on October 26, 2001, was one of the first major pieces of legislation passed in response to the attacks. It granted the federal government sweeping powers to monitor communications, conduct searches without warrants, and detain individuals suspected of having links to terrorism. One of the most controversial aspects of the act was its provision that allowed law enforcement agencies to wiretap phone conversations and access private records, such as library books checked out or financial transactions, without needing to inform the individual involved. This raised serious concerns about privacy violations and the potential for government overreach. Critics of the Patriot Act argue that it infringed on fundamental constitutional rights, particularly the Fourth Amendment, which protects citizens from unreasonable searches and seizures. The law allowed for broad surveillance and intelligence-gathering activities that were previously unheard of in peacetime. Proponents of the act, however, contended that it was necessary to protect national security and prevent further terrorist attacks. Still, the act's passage was seen by many as a step toward the normalization of intrusive government surveillance in the name of security, and it fueled fears that the U.S. was moving toward a surveillance state. Beyond the Patriot Act, other measures were implemented that significantly altered the landscape of personal freedoms in America. The creation of the Department of Homeland Security, DHS, in 2003 was another major development. The DHS consolidated various federal agencies tasked with protecting the U.S. from terrorism into a single entity, which gained unprecedented power over domestic security. Among the department's many functions was its oversight of airport security, including the Transportation Security Administration, TSA, which took over the responsibility for screening passengers and luggage at airports. This led to the implementation of strict security measures, including the removal of shoes, belts, and other items before boarding, as well as the increased use of full body scanners. Many of these measures, though intended to protect the public, also raised concerns about personal privacy and the potential for abuse of power. Critics feared that the extensive surveillance capabilities granted to government agencies under the Patriot Act and the creation of the DHS marked the beginning of a new era of government control over ordinary citizens. The argument was that 9/11, with its horrific and traumatic impact, served as the catalyst for the establishment of policies that would have been unthinkable in peacetime. The theory suggests that the government capitalized on the fear and outrage caused by the attacks to implement policies that would give authorities vast new powers, without the checks and balances typically associated with safeguarding individual rights. The theory that 9/11 was used to justify the erosion of civil liberties is further supported by the growing trend of government surveillance in the years that followed. Programs such as the National Security Agency's NSA mass data collection efforts, revealed by whistleblower Edward Snowden in 2013, showed that the U.S. government had been collecting phone records, emails, and other personal data from millions of Americans. While the government argued that these measures were necessary for national security, many saw them as a blatant invasion of privacy, and they further fueled suspicions about the true motivations behind post-9/11 policies. In addition to the expansion of surveillance powers, the post-9/11 period also saw a significant shift in the U.S. government's approach to detainees and the treatment of suspected terrorists. The establishment of detention facilities such as Guantanamo Bay, where individuals suspected of terrorism were held without trial, raised questions about the violation of human rights and the suspension of due process. The practice of extraordinary rendition, in which suspects were secretly transported to other countries for interrogation, also sparked outrage. These actions were justified by the government on the grounds of national security, but they were widely condemned as violations of international law and human rights. For many, the imposition of these measures represented a dangerous shift in the balance between security and liberty. The theory that the 9/11 attacks were exploited as a means to justify the curtailing of civil rights argues that the government used the fear generated by the attacks to create a climate in which the public would be willing to sacrifice personal freedoms in exchange for security. The erosion of privacy, the expansion of surveillance, and the indefinite detention of suspects became emblematic of the broader concerns about the loss of civil liberties in the wake of 9/11. In conclusion, the theory that the 9/11 attacks were used to justify the erosion of civil liberties and the expansion of government power remains a central topic in discussions about the aftermath of the attacks. While the government maintains that the measures were necessary to prevent future terrorist attacks, many critics believe that they marked the beginning of a dangerous trend toward an authoritarian state. The Patriot Act, the creation of the DHS, the rise of mass surveillance, and the controversial treatment of detainees all raised profound questions about the balance between security and individual freedoms. For some, the events of 9/11 were not just an opportunity to fight terrorism, but also a chance to reshape the U.S. political and legal landscape in ways that would have lasting consequences for generations to come. As the years passed following the 9/11 attacks, the widespread skepticism and growing number of questions about the official narrative prompted many to seek alternative explanations. One of the most significant aspects of the 9/11 conspiracy theories is the role of the media in shaping public perception of the attacks and their aftermath. Many theorists believe that the media, either knowingly or unknowingly, played a crucial role in promoting the official story while suppressing or ignoring evidence that might have challenged it. This has led to the belief that the mainstream media, far from being a neutral entity, may have been complicit in shaping a narrative that supported the government's agenda and the war on terror. In the immediate aftermath of 9/11, the media played an essential role in shaping public opinion and framing the attacks as an act of war. The coverage focused heavily on the human tragedy of the day, the devastation caused by the collapse of the Twin Towers, and the heroism of first responders. However, critics argue that this initial wave of emotional coverage was followed by a shift in tone that served to justify the government's response, particularly its military actions in Afghanistan and Iraq. The media became a powerful tool for disseminating the government's message about the war on terror, often presenting it as a moral crusade against an existential threat posed by terrorist groups like Al-Qaeda. At the same time, alternative voices that questioned the official narrative were often marginalized or dismissed as conspiracy theorists. Mainstream news outlets, particularly in the U.S., rarely gave airtime to those who questioned the events of 9/11 or sought to uncover inconsistencies in the government's account. Some critics argue that this was a deliberate effort to stifle dissent and prevent the public from engaging in critical questioning of the official version of events. Rather than investigating alternative explanations, the media largely focused on promoting a unified message of national security, patriotism, and support for the military interventions that followed the attacks. The media's relationship with the government became particularly concerning in the lead-up to the invasion of Iraq in 2003. Many outlets were accused of uncritically reporting the government's claims about Iraq's weapons of mass destruction, WMDs, and its ties to Al-Qaeda. In the months leading up to the war, reports based on faulty intelligence and anonymous sources painted a picture of an imminent threat posed by Saddam Hussein's regime. The press, particularly in the U.S., amplified these claims, creating a narrative that convinced many Americans that military intervention was necessary. When it was later revealed that no WMDs were found in Iraq, many felt that the media had been complicit in misleading the public, and this further fueled suspicions about the true motivations behind the war. This relationship between the media and the government has led some to argue that the media's role in the aftermath of 9/11 was not simply passive, but active in shaping a narrative that suited the interests of the government and powerful elites. The argument is that the media, as a key component of the establishment, was instrumental in promoting the idea that the attacks were a direct result of Islamic terrorism and that the only response was military action. In doing so, the media helped to create a climate in which questioning the official narrative was seen as unpatriotic or even dangerous. In addition to the mainstream media, many alternative media outlets and independent journalists began to challenge the official version of events. These voices were often marginalized or ridiculed, but they played a critical role in promoting skepticism about the government's account of the attacks. Websites, documentaries, and books dedicated to investigating 9/11 conspiracy theories began to proliferate, offering alternative explanations for what happened that day. These outlets questioned everything from the collapse of the Twin Towers to the role of the U.S. military in responding to the hijackings, and they often pointed out inconsistencies or gaps in the official reports. Despite the lack of mainstream support, the alternative media's influence grew over time. As more people turned to the internet for information, the alternative narratives surrounding 9/11 gained traction, particularly through social media platforms and online communities. This decentralized information sharing allowed for greater discussion and debate about the attacks, as well as for the spread of theories that challenged the official story. However, the internet also became a battleground for competing narratives, with both mainstream and alternative media outlets vying for the attention of the public. The role of the media in promoting the official story of 9/11 while downplaying or ignoring alternative theories remains a key issue in the ongoing debate over the attacks. Many conspiracy theorists argue that the media was complicit in creating a false narrative that served the interests of the government and powerful corporate entities. The question of media complicity is not limited to 9/11, but reflects broader concerns about the media's role in shaping public perception and advancing certain political and economic agendas. In the case of 9/11, the media's failure to critically examine the official narrative has contributed to the ongoing sense of doubt and suspicion that surrounds the events of that day. In conclusion, the media's role in shaping the story of 9/11 cannot be understated. From the immediate coverage of the attacks to the justification of the wars that followed, the mainstream media has played a central role in framing the events in a way that served the interests of the government and its allies. For many, the media's failure to investigate alternative explanations and its uncritical acceptance of the official narrative only deepened the sense that something more was at play on that fateful day. Whether or not the media was complicit in a broader conspiracy remains a point of contention, but its role in shaping the public's understanding of 9/11 is undeniable. As we continue to reflect on the events of that day, the role of the media in crafting the narrative remains one of the most important and debated aspects of the story. The search for the truth behind the events of September 11, 2001, has become an ongoing pursuit for many people, even nearly 2 decades after the attacks. The persistence of conspiracy theories surrounding 9/11, despite the official investigations and the government's narrative, highlights the deep-rooted skepticism that continues to shape how people perceive not only the attacks but also the broader political and economic systems that followed. For some, the unanswered questions and perceived inconsistencies in the official story leave a sense of distrust that cannot be easily assuaged. The search for the truth about 9/11 remains a complex and multi-layered issue, one that intertwines national security, government transparency, and the manipulation of public perception. As we look back on the aftermath of 9/11, it's evident that the events of that day were not only tragic but also transformative in ways that continue to resonate today. The War on Terror, the invasions of Afghanistan and Iraq, the establishment of the Department of Homeland Security, and the passing of laws like the Patriot Act all had profound effects on the global political landscape, as well as on the lives of ordinary people. Yet, for many, these events raised questions about the true motivations behind the attacks and the actions taken in their wake. Was the U.S. government simply responding to terrorism, or was there a more intricate web of motives and agendas at play? The idea that 9/11 was the result of a larger, more coordinated conspiracy involving the government or powerful elites is one of the most enduring theories. The suggestion that the attacks were used as a pretext for war, the expansion of the military-industrial complex, or even the erosion of civil liberties is troubling to many who feel that the full truth has yet to be revealed. While no conclusive evidence has emerged to support the most extreme claims of government involvement, the questions about intelligence failures, media manipulation, and financial gains in the aftermath of the attacks continue to fuel public distrust. One of the main issues that keeps the 9/11 conspiracy theories alive is the lack of transparency in the official investigations and the way they were conducted. The 9/11 Commission report, while thorough in many respects, left some important questions unanswered or only partially addressed. For instance, the issue of why the U.S. military was unable to respond to the hijacked planes in a timely manner, or the role of certain intelligence agencies in missing key signs of the plot, remains a contentious point. Furthermore, the details surrounding the collapse of the World Trade Center towers and the Pentagon attack have raised legitimate concerns about the adequacy of the explanations offered by the official reports. Beyond these issues, the broader implications of 9/11 continue to shape the way we think about power, governance, and the role of the state. The aftermath of 9/11 saw an unprecedented expansion of government surveillance, a loss of privacy for citizens, and the creation of an entire security apparatus designed to combat terrorism. For many, the cost of these measures, both in terms of civil liberties and public trust, has been too high. The debate over whether these measures were truly necessary or whether they were part of a broader agenda to consolidate power continues to be a point of contention. The idea that 9/11 could have been used as a tool for advancing a hidden agenda is not just a theory. For many, it is a question that needs to be answered in order to understand the true scope of the attacks and their aftermath. While some argue that the government's actions in response to 9/11 were justified by the scale of the attacks and the need for national security, others believe that the events of that day provided a convenient excuse for larger geopolitical and economic shifts that had been in the works for years. The possibility that the attacks could have been facilitated or allowed to happen for political gain is a powerful and unsettling theory, one that forces us to examine the motivations of those in power. For many, the search for the truth is not just about uncovering hidden facts, but about restoring a sense of justice and accountability. The question remains: who truly benefits from the 9/11 attacks? Whether it's the defense contractors who saw a boom in business, the politicians who were able to rally the public behind military action, or the intelligence agencies who expanded their reach in the name of national security, there are those who believe that the attacks served more than one purpose. The question of what happened on that day, and why, continues to haunt us, and it's one that may never fully be answered. In the end, the search for the truth behind 9/11 is a reflection of broader concerns about trust, power, and accountability in society. The more people feel that they are being kept in the dark about the true causes and consequences of the events, the more they will be drawn to alternative explanations. Whether or not those explanations hold any merit, they reflect a deep and ongoing need for transparency and justice. As time passes, the impact of 9/11 continues to be felt, not just in terms of the wars and policies that followed, but in the way we perceive the actions of those in power and the institutions that govern our lives. For many, the search for the truth is not just a quest for answers, but a means of making sense of a world forever changed by that tragic day. The events of September 11, 2001, will forever be etched in history, not just as a tragic attack that claimed thousands of innocent lives, but also as a moment that fundamentally altered the way the world viewed security, politics, and power. Despite the official narrative provided by the U.S. government and multiple investigations that followed, the controversies surrounding the attacks have persisted, fueling skepticism and alternative theories. As we've seen throughout this exploration of the 9/11 conspiracy theories, the quest for understanding extends far beyond the immediate destruction and loss of life. It's about seeking answers to the deeper questions that continue to resonate today. What really happened that day, and why? One of the central aspects of the 9/11 conspiracy theories is the idea that the attacks themselves may not have been the full story. For many, the events of that day served as a pretext for a broader political and military agenda, one that was executed under the guise of national security and the war on terror. Whether it was the economic benefits to certain industries, the expansion of government surveillance, or the opportunity to advance military operations in the Middle East, the idea that the attacks might have been used to further the interests of powerful elites is a disturbing yet persistent theory. The evidence for these claims is mostly circumstantial, but it's undeniable that the aftermath of 9/11 saw significant changes in U.S. foreign and domestic policy. The invasions of Afghanistan and Iraq, which followed shortly after the attacks, were seen by many as an extension of long-standing geopolitical interests rather than purely a response to terrorism. The huge economic gains for defense contractors and the private sector involved in homeland security also raised eyebrows. The passing of the USA Patriot Act, which significantly expanded government surveillance powers, sparked a broader conversation about the balance between national security and civil liberties, one that remains ongoing to this day. Equally significant is the role of the media in shaping the narrative around 9/11 and its aftermath. The mainstream media, by largely adhering to the official version of events, played an instrumental role in framing the attacks and justifying the subsequent wars. This close relationship between the media and the government raised questions about the role of the press in holding powerful institutions accountable and prompted concerns about the potential for media complicity in the creation of a national story that served the interests of the few. While some argue that the media merely followed the public's need for clarity and comfort after a horrific attack, Others believe that it functioned as a tool for advancing a political agenda. In addition to these concerns, the massive expansion of government power in the name of security created a new dynamic between citizens and the state. The rise of surveillance, the creation of the Department of Homeland Security, and the enforcement of laws that restrict civil liberties have led many to question whether the price of security has been too high. For those who believe the government used 9/11 as an opportunity to consolidate power, the question remains: was the attack used as a means to justify an expanded state presence in everyday life? The wars, the surveillance programs, and the policies that followed all seem to have served the dual purpose of combating terrorism and reshaping the political landscape. As we consider the lasting impact of 9/11 on American society and the world, the conspiracy theories continue to thrive, even as they are often dismissed or ridiculed. For many, these theories represent more than just a search for alternative explanations. They reflect a desire for justice and accountability in the face of enormous tragedy and loss. The refusal to accept the official story is not necessarily about rejecting the grief or horror of the day, but rather about seeking a fuller, more nuanced understanding of what happened and why. It's about challenging the narrative that has been told and demanding transparency from those in power. Perhaps the most significant legacy of 9/11, aside from the loss of life and the wars that followed, is the shift in the way the public interacts with power. Whether or not the conspiracy theories are true, they have become a lens through which many view government actions, foreign policy, and the relationship between the state and the individual. The fact that so many continue to ask questions about what really happened on 9/11 is a testament to the deep mistrust that exists, not just in the events of that day, but in the institutions that govern our lives. In conclusion, the 9/11 attacks and their aftermath have left an indelible mark on the world. While the official narrative remains the accepted version for most, the unanswered questions and lingering doubts continue to fuel the search for alternative explanations. The theories that have emerged challenge us to think critically about power, control, and the role of the state in shaping history. The story of 9/11 is far from over, and for many, the truth remains elusive. Whether or not the full extent of the story will ever be revealed, the questions raised by 9/11 are ones that will continue to shape our world for years to come.